Genesis chapter 3. Look with me briefly, let's go to chapter 2, Genesis 2, verse 8. The Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord God made every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Step forward to chapter 3. The serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And the Lord had said not to eat of this tree, and yet Eve took a look. Verse 6, when the woman saw that the tree was good, it was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree was desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and she ate. Oh, this started with the deception. Did God really say, did he really mean that you would die? You wouldn't really die. I mean, that's kind of radical from he's a good God. He just created all. He's not really going to kill you, is he? The enemy puts doubt in the decision-making process. And then with our human eyes, and Eve was just a human. She was in paradise, though. They're in paradise with God. But how do you tell paradise? You don't realize it's paradise because you've not experienced anything other than that. The opportunity to trust God. Man, everybody's going, man, I wouldn't have done it. I would have been better at that. No, you wouldn't. I wouldn't either. The enemy introduced doubt into the decision-making process, and with her eyes, she saw two choices. And frankly, they both look very similar. It's just a tree. And a tree. What was the difference? This one was okay. Man, that's forbidden. Man, that looked really good. The only reason he was looking at the tree was because the doubt was introduced into the decision-making process. And I really see all week is this idea of this decision-making process of our inability and incapacity really to make sound decisions on our own because our eyes fool us, our emotions fool us. They lead us down paths and we don't even realize we're on those paths until it's too late. It was a choice between life as defined by God and life as defined by man, which isn't life at all, but death. It was life and death. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like I have all this blessing and I can enjoy all this blessing, plus I can have life on my terms and thinking I can eat of this and take of this and what harm will come from it. And in our mind, we can deceive ourselves. We can go down that path and we can say, that decision is a sound decision because it's good for me, it's good for my eyes, it's pleasant for food, it's desirable. What bad can come from it? And their eyes were open. And right away, you think of the verse, there is a way that seems right to man, but its end is the way of death. And so there's a fundamental shift in humanity that the default position at the beginning as God created was that man would be in the presence of God, holy, and in fellowship with God, and in relationship with God, with no barriers, with no, we can't even begin to imagine what that must have been like. But the fundamental shift, the default position is now one of sin, of sinfulness, of deception, of this darkness, of being separate from God because of a decision. A decision that any one of us would have repeated. And if we're not convinced, we get a whole book. We get a whole book full of those decisions of mankind as God takes us from this garden through the redemption story and brings us back to the garden if we follow him. And the whole book is full of God's efforts and God's speaking into humanity and man's rejection over and over again. Go with me to Deuteronomy 30. Got too many bookmarks, I gotta find them all. Deuteronomy 30 Deuteronomy was like a month of sermons by Moses. I don't know if it was a month, but it's 30 some odd sermons of Moses speaking into these people's life because they're getting ready to go into the promise of God, but Moses doesn't get to go with them. This is like a dad speaking to his kids like, when you do this, remember. You know how many times he says remember in Deuteronomy? It's just over and over. Remember God has spoken this in your life. Remember that you've made some bad decisions. Remember what is going to happen, and over. They're called essentially to make wise decisions. And you go down to verse 15 of chapter 30. And he says, I have set before you today life and good and death and evil. He's laid it all out. This is what it looks like. If you follow God, if you follow his ways and you're obedient, you love him, and you have faith and believe his promises, you have life and good. But when you don't, you're going to have death. You're going to have evil. You're going to have darkness. You're going to have all the fruit of your poor choices. We go up to verse 17, and he lays it out very plainly. He says, if your heart turns away so that you don't hear and you're drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, it's a turning away of the heart. It's a turning away, and to turn away from God is to turn towards these other gods, towards the world. In verse 19, he says, I call heaven and earth as witnesses. So all of creation, which was given to man, initially given to man, that was lost by Adam and Eve. But he calls all of heaven, all of creation, God's creation that he created, and he calls it all as a witness against them today. That I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing, and therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. Our lives are full of choices every day. And over in the scriptures, we are just encouraged to choose God, to choose his way. It's just like the garden. The choices often look very much the same. Maybe sometimes the evil choice even looks a little more appealing to our flesh. We begin to reason those things, that evil out. We know what the right choice is. We look at that and go, but it would be fun. It'd be nice. Nobody will know. Nobody will get hurt. We begin to add all these reasons. We justify it in many ways, our choice of evil, as if we're only We're always in full control. We've always convinced ourselves we're in full control of this choice of choosing this evil. When we know deep down inside we're turning away from God. How is it that we can convince ourselves that even as Christians, we can say, I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Christ, but I'm choosing other things. He makes it very clear when you choose those things, you've turned to them and you've turned away from God. He said, choose life. And that life will flow through your life to your descendants. Verse 20, he says that you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey his voice, and then finally, that you may cling to him. For he is your life and the length of your days. He says, choose life so that you can love God, obey his voice, and cling to him. That he is the source of your life. We could go to many examples through the Bible of these choices and these turning points in life, of examples where God has set before them. This happens in our lives every day, these choices. Go to Romans 12. That might seem like an odd entry into Romans 12. Introduction. But I think that's what Paul has delivered us to, this choice. Because we can read Romans 12 and go, this is very beautiful language, and it's very appealing, and it sounds really good when you're in church. It sounds really good when you're in worship, in your devotion time. You could read, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. The man doing that is a whole different deal. Our ability to choose wisely is flawed in so many ways. And Paul has brought us all the way through Romans, through these first 11 chapters, to bring us to this point in chapter 12. And it's almost like he's saying, look, we have talked about all of these things, from justification through sanctification, through the Jews, through the Gentiles, through answered all the questions. Remember the sort of this objector that always posed these questions, sort of pretend person that Paul used to ask those hard questions. Paul answered the questions. He's like, I've answered all the questions now. We've come to this point. Now it's time to get in the game. Well, what does that take to get in the game? Because otherwise we could just keep gathering all this feel-good, warm language, and it speaks to us, and we go, yes, I understand, Paul. And now it's time for you to get in the game. Now it's time for the rubber to meet the road. It's a whole different deal. We examined justification. We examined God's love and God's mercy. We examined God's ways. We were told that he loves us and that we can't be separated from this love that is found in him through Christ. That our life is of him and through him and to him. And it's like that life in the garden. He spoke of the depth of riches, the wisdom and knowledge, the totality of God, which is completely unsearchable, unknowable in our minds in totality. Yet we can know him, but we can't ever really just fully grasp and know him that completely. And so it's almost like Paul walks you up to this doorway. He's explained everything that brought you to this point. He's opening the door and he's saying, here's what's out there for you. You remember a little kid when somebody would say, you need to go in the other room and do this. And you'd find out why. Because it's dark in there. And there's no light on, and I don't know what's in there. And I remember seeing that in kids. I remember as a kid going, I ain't going in there. Paul's like taking you to the door, and he's opening the door, and he's turned all the lights on. He's explained everything that led you to this door, why it's important for you to step through the door, but I can't push you through the door. I beseech you. I plead with you. I beg you. The word is parakleo. It's very closely related to paraclete, very closely related to Holy Spirit. I'm coming alongside you. I'm bringing you right to this door, and I turned all the lights on for you. I can't do any more. I can't live your life for you. I can't bring fruit into your life. You have to now go. You have to step forward through this door. Man, that's our flesh wants to say, I'll lean in and peek a little bit, but I always want to leave it 1 foot outside the door. The door's going to go close, but I put my foot in the door just to make sure I keep the back way open. This is what we do. This is the sinfulness in us. That we can't just completely say, God has said this. I believe it, and I'm going to walk it. And we can claim that. The children of Israel said, Moses, we're all in. And we're at the base of the mountain. Moses come down the mountain. And after the whole calf incident, a little slight correction there. After that, so we have the corrections. He comes down and he's like, okay, this is what God has said. And they, well, we're in. Moses, we're going to follow God. He's like, we're in. We're completely in. And how far do we get before the grumbling starts? We thought in meant life on our turn. We thought in meant there was never going to be any pain, never sorrow, that it always looked very refreshing and bright and shiny, and it would always be appealing to our flesh. We didn't know in meant sometimes we got to just trust you and walk through a dark place. We don't like that. We don't like that. Paul is saying in is walking through into this beautiful life of the promises of God, and that he's not shoving you through by yourself, but he's walking in you and comforting you and loving you and guiding you along the way. So as we enter into chapter 12, Paul delivers us this place, and is really about making sure that we have that proper relationship with God. And then that delivers us to this place where we understand what a right view of ourself is, what a right view of other believers is, and a right view of our gifts. And we see all this, and we'll see it in the coming weeks in chapter 12. But right from the very beginning, we have to have this proper view of our relationship with God. This is for me, this is why the Lord has said we should take communion, that we should gather together as believers. And it's that remember thing that Moses spoke about in Deuteronomy. It is a table of remembrance, and it is a remembrance not just of what Christ has done for you, but a remembrance of you without Christ. And a remembrance of what the road you were on and what you were going to be delivered to and what life was like apart from Christ, because it's a remembrance of the great chasm that existed between you and God and what Christ did on your behalf to bring you into fellowship with God. And I think it's so important to continually remember and reestablish and reconfirm that that's why I stand where. That's the remembrance of my wretchedness. Makes his holiness so beautiful and so amazing. Paul brings you to the door and he says, I beseech you, I plead and I urge. I think one translation says urge. I plead with you, I urge you. It's so important. Don't just pass over this, but understand, I urge you. And he sees the word therefore is wrapping it right up with everything up until that point. Because therefore is saying, because we've arrived through these first 11 chapters, he didn't write it in chapters, we put chapters in there. But because of all that he taught and all of that doctrine brought him to this point, then he says, I beseech you, I beg and urge you, because of all of these things, brethren, by the mercies of God. What are these mercies of God? What are these mercies of God that he speaks of? It's the very basis for his pleading. The mercies are those foundational things that Paul is standing on. And he's saying, because of all of these mercies, you've come to this point. Well, what are the mercies? I think Paul, when he says, because of these mercies of God, I think he's referring to the whole first 11 chapters. I think it was like a header that says everything we studied up to this point. The mercies of God. So we could go back through the first 11 chapters. We go, God's wrath abides on the unrighteous. That was us. We were the unrighteous. All have fallen short of his glory. All have sinned. He is just. He is holy, and there's a judgment coming. But he's also merciful and kind and loving. And he made a way. And there is only one way to salvation, and that is by faith that you arrive at that. It's through grace. He's justified by faith, dead to sin, alive in Christ. That we are justified by that act of faith, of believing what he said, believing what he did, and believing that it is on our behalf. And it's by that we are justified, made righteous. Not just passed over, not looked past our sin, but that they've been paid for in full, that we are justified, made righteous in the sight of God, and we become dead to sin, we become alive in Christ. He made a point there's no special deal for the Jews. God makes no distinction of race, creed, color, anything. But we're all his creation, created in his image. Because we are justified, we find ourselves in a place where there is no condemnation. This is in chapter 8, Paul said we are debtors. We have an obligation to live by the Spirit. And when you live by the Spirit, you're sons and daughters of God. You have an obligation to walk by that Spirit. And as we said, God's judgments, his wisdom, his knowledge, unsearchable. His amazing depth of riches. These are those mercies that Paul is referring to. This is the mercies of God. One commentator put it like this, said everything from here on is like putting on mercy-colored glasses. It's looking at life through mercy-colored glasses, that we arrived at this point doctrinally because of God's mercy and all that he has done. And so everything we look at, we're looking at through in the context of mercy, that this is the very foundational stuff Paul is saying that allows him to come to this point and say, I beseech you, I beg and plead with you by these very mercies that brought us to this point. I beg you to present yourself. Present your bodies To me, this is just a picture. You guys have heard me say it many times. It's part of my understanding of it. Is that I stand before God. It's as if standing. And I remember standing there the first time in His presence, understanding His grace, because I first time really understood my wretchedness. I say, God, I used this body and this mind, these feet, to chase my way. To chase that evil, to chase that thing that appealed to my eye. To pursue life on my terms. God, now here I am, Lord. I'm beat up, messed up. Lord, I ain't much. I ain't got much to offer. But here I am, Lord. Take these hands and these feet, this heart and this mind, put it to work for you, Lord. I give it all to you, Lord. You know, it wasn't unusual in those days, and frankly, it's still done today. It's done a little bit differently, but for all of those that were worshiping other gods, it was very normal for them to bring a sacrifice. The sacrifices looked different on what sort of gods they were chasing after, but it was very normal to bring some sort of sacrifice. And so when he's speaking this to the church in Rome, they understood the whole idea of sacrifice. We talked about this presentation, but this whole idea of presenting your body, presenting you, where you become the sacrifice. And for us, Jesus is our sacrifice, that Christ was that sacrifice on our behalf. He appeased the righteousness of God, and he did so forever. And then he rose again, and he became the first idea of a living sacrifice, because sacrifices died. The first thing a sacrifice did is it had no choice. It had no vote. And it had no breath. For the Jews, it had no blood. And it was offered. Christ is a different sacrifice in that he did have a choice. And he went willingly for you. And that when he overcame death, he was resurrected and he is alive again, and he becomes this living sacrifice. And for us to follow after Jesus is to become a living sacrifice ourselves. To make that choice to die as he made a choice to physically die. We make a choice to set aside all of the choices. They're all over our lives every day. Good versus evil. And oftentimes we don't even look at it on those terms. But to follow Christ is to take my choices off the table. See, my choices don't matter. My choices are determined by him. The Old Testament pattern is very clear of death before sacrifice. Sacrifice before holiness. Leviticus speaks of the peace offering. A peace offering was an animal sacrifice, and it was sprinkling of blood. And then there was this eating of this meat and the sacrifice and having fellowship with God. It's doing these things in the presence of the Lord. But it's not just the sacrifice that was important to God. It wasn't just the death of this animal or the fellowship and the eating part of it, but it was the heart. And he reminds us of that in Psalm 51. You did not desire sacrifice, or else I would give it. You did not delight in burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. A broken spirit doesn't make choices out of flesh and of carnality. A broken spirit has broken away from that old life. A broken spirit is completely submitted to the will of God. A broken and a contrite heart. These, O God, you will not despise. Paul's showing us a similar thought, a similar idea. He speaks of these mercies that come from the death of Christ. That we present ourselves in thankfulness and sort of this idea of this thank offering, this peace offering of standing before God. Submitting ourselves, presenting our bodies to Him. Trust me, God never looked at any of us and go, wow, I really got a good deal today. Right? He said, I beseech you, I beg you to present your bodies a living sacrifice. The idea of a living sacrifice in a pagan world was ridiculous. It was not talked about. It was no such thing. Christ is the living sacrifice. The idea of being a sacrifice for Christ, the idea of being a martyr, maybe, for Christians, that idea, we have the ability to accept that. We don't necessarily like the idea at the beginning. We wouldn't necessarily volunteer for that duty. But when push came to shove, God said, I need you to lay it all down right now. Right now, I need you to lay it all down for me. I think we have the ability to do that. To sort of go down in a blaze of religious glory, man, we can lay it all down. But when Christ says lay it all down every day, every minute of your entire life for all your decisions, lay it down. That's a whole different thing for us. That's a whole lot harder for us. Because the life of following Christ is every breath and every heartbeat. There's 1,000 decisions every day. Abraham took Isaac to the Mount of God, and the mountain that God showed him, he said, take your son up there. Called him his only son. He was the son of promise. He laid Isaac on the altar because that's what God told him to do. It was his son he waited for a long time. Abraham had to be thinking, man, this is crazy. If I sacrifice him, how will God's promises come true? God promised me land. He promised me this huge family as great as the sand of the sea, as the stars in the sky. I'm afraid God's about to mess up. I mean, that would be the way a human mind would reason this. But man, he shows his faith because he lays his son on the altar. And he lifts the knife. God never sacrificed humans like that. He never asked that before, but God said, lay your son on the altar. And he did. And right before, as you know the story goes, he stopped him right before he sacrificed him, right before the knife was brought down. And in essence, his son was as good as dead all the way traveling there because he believed he was going to do exactly what God told him to do. Because he believed by faith that God told him for a reason, for a purpose, And that it wasn't his problem to resolve this, it was God's problem. When God said, take your son to the altar, he's like, man, God's got a problem. How is he going to work this? God, how is he going to be good to his promises? That's God's problem. We constantly step up and we want to take that and fix that for God and help him out a little here and there. This is exactly what the Israelites going to the promised land, and they send spies into the land. Why was that important? If we're going in by faith, why was it important spies go to the land? I think it was important because they needed to understand this was not going to be easy. But do you believe that God gave you that land? Because if you believe that God gave you that land, then those giants, they are God's problem. They're your problem. Did God give you that or not? And they had to make that decision. And instead of believing that God gave them the land and that God had a problem with that, they said, yeah, we believe God can part the sea, bring us out of all this, and God can do a lot of amazing things, but giants, I don't know. And so they wandered the wilderness until they all died off. What a great choice. There's a man called Theodore of Heraclea. He was a Christian martyr. He said, I know not your gods. Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, is my God. Beat, tear, or burn me. And if my words offend you, cut out my tongue. Every part of my body is ready when God calls for it as a sacrifice. You there yet? Are we there yet? What do we have to give? Yourself. You didn't bring anything to this dance. You didn't bring anything to this relationship with God. He brought it all. He brought it all for you and on your behalf. The only thing you have to give is your will. The life that he's given you is giving it back to him to spend it as he sees fit. And that scares us, right? I'm going to give back my life to God. What if he asked me to go over preach to Afghanistan? What if I had to go like in the middle of Africa? And you know what? If he decides to spend your life that way, he's going to take that heart that's submitted and he's going to change it to where that'll be such a passion. You won't find contentment in this life until you do that very thing that he created you for. Because going to that place and preaching the gospel will be like going to the garden of God and stepping into his presence and having fellowship with him. And to not go what he called you to do, to not go and do that thing, is to look at that other tree and step away. Oswald Chambers says we have the idea that we can dedicate our gifts to God, and however, you cannot dedicate what is not yours. There's actually only one thing you can dedicate to God, and that is your right to yourself. If you will give God your right to yourself, he will make a holy experiment out of you, and his experiments always succeed. The one true mark of a saint of God is the inner creativity that flows from being totally surrendered to Jesus Christ. We present ourselves living real life. Life on God's terms. Life His way. We present ourselves holy, set apart for the purpose of God, completely and wholly. Whatever you call me to, God. And if it scares the tar out of me, Lord, give me the courage. Give me the conviction. Give me all I need, and He will. I'm convinced He will. I've lived it. Many of you have. There's no greater adventure than living in faith and seeing God equip you to do the things that you're scared to death of. Your flesh, that fear rises up in our flesh. We want to run and hide in the dark. Present ourselves living and holy and acceptable. How do we present ourselves as acceptable? The only thing that will make ourselves acceptable is when we come by faith. But without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. That's how we present ourselves acceptable as we come by faith. We often want to know what that looks like. God, I come before you. Just let me know what you want to do, and I'll think it over and get back to you. I mean, that's what it sounded like if we ever said it out loud. We kind of laugh like, oh, it's kind of stupid. That's what it sounded like we said it out loud. I'll think about it, God, and get back to you. You know what? Many people that claim and profess Christ have spent their entire life thinking about it and never stepped through the door and never enjoyed real fellowship with God. Never presented themselves, because that's laying it all out there. You know, one of the big steps for me was when I first started singing worship. I mean, it still is. It really is. But I just get used to bumbling words and messing up. So it's just, but it was a big step for me. Because you're just like putting it all out there. And you're singing, and your flesh wants to go, well, what if somebody laughs at you? What if you sing a bad note? What if, man, if our life, it becomes a life of what ifs, something's broke. And that was a big step for me to finally do that. And you know what? I took the step, God took all the fear away, all sort of the stage fright type thing away. And I was committed to praising and worshiping God with all that I have. That's all I want to do. And it's such a blessing. You know, the greatest worship now for me is to sit at that piano when nobody's here. It's just me and God. And He gave me a passion for this. To worship, to be in His presence, to use that. And which was the passion to say, I ain't got any clue how to play the piano, but I think I want to learn. Like, that's what it felt like when I started. Like, these hands don't work that way. You didn't think it'd ever work, and I'll never be great at it, but what a great joy, what a blessing. And you know what? A year and a half ago, I found out I got cancer on my lip. I'm like, God, are you aware of this? God, I use this like every Sunday. I'm singing praise and I'm speaking your word. God, you know, that initial response was that sort of that flesh welling up and that fear saying, God's forgot about you. It's the enemy whispering in your ear. God, see, he didn't really. He really got your back. It was just sort of that initial shock of finding out you got cancer on your lip, and you come to that point, you go, God, whatever you want me to do. If I'm going to continue to teach and preach, Lord, whatever you want me to do, you bought me and paid for me. And I just want to present myself to you once again, Lord. And I'm telling you, it's a hard place to be. And many of you have gone through similar things. And we probably all will go through something very similar to that. Maybe multiple times. We present ourselves, and we do so as a reasonable service. The word service there, it really is kind of a word that connects us to this idea of the priest in the temple, of the priest in the temple being consecrated and set apart for this work of worship, this work of serving God and serving man on God's behalf. And this reasonableness of this is this idea of right thinking. Because any right thinking would bring you to this place that I should present myself because of what he's done. This is reasonable. This is right. The word for reasonable there is logikos. The Greek word is logikos. It's logical. It's reasonable. It's rational. It's right. The true sacrifice offered from a right heart was pleasing and acceptable to the Lord because it's logical. It's just logical. God desires your love, your will, and your obedience. Instead of speaking of our desires and our wants and our rights, and this is what we see in the world, right? It's my right. It's my way. What about me? It's all about you. Instead of your desires and your wants and your rights as a human, we begin to speak of our obligation and our commitment and our conviction to the one who died for us and gave you a choice. Took you right back to that place in the garden. Except now your default position is one of death, an eternal separation from God. But he gave you a beautiful choice to go back again and choose God. So it's logical to live in that place of obligation, of commitment, of love and thankfulness and obedience. He says go, we say when and how fast, God? Not let me think about it. Psalm 116, and I'll end with this. I will pay my vows to the Lord now in the presence of all his people. Precious is in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. O Lord, truly I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your maidservant. You have loosed my bonds. I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving and will call upon the name of the Lord. Let's make that our prayer.